I'm going to talk about a bit of what my company has done to not only to help a project in the Netherlands, but to also inform a very active debate in the United States, which I'll come back to as we go along. It turns out that some very nice people have said some very good things that people have now ignored for years. This is from the National Committee on Vital and Health Statistics, a very respectable body of sober people who say what I believe are good things. And indeed, they talk about a personal health record is something other than a toy or a hobby. And in effect, what they are saying is, you know, if you all are serious about a personal health record, if you all are serious about empowering patients, you need to have something that doesn't just sit off in a dusty corner. It has to be something that has a vibrant interactivity with the rest of the healthcare ecosystem. Well, of course, we love this stuff at Tolven because we started out designing for the ecosystem. In other words, a personal health record for us is a manifestation. It's a personality in the ecosystem. But the information is identical to what's in the rest of the ecosystem. The same information is used for doctor's office records, hospital records, clinical research, population epidemiology, and that's sort of our approach to this whole topic. Tolven was founded in 2006, early in 2006, and we've been cranking along and having a lot of fun. So, the idea is that a consumer controls who can access their health information. Consumer pay, you know, I've been a doctor for 26 years. It's really hard for me to get my mouth around this term consumer, but I'm getting there. But it's okay. I like it. Now, this is where we get wound around the axle of the consent debate that's going on in the United States, because you even heard just a bit of that before. The term patient portal has an implication that the patient is allowed to look at his or her information in your doctor's record. Interesting, isn't it? So I'm a Kaiser patient. I get to look at my information as it is held by Kaiser, some of it. It's better than nothing. I'm okay with that. But I don't have a personal health record. Don't even try to pass that off as a personal health record because I can't contribute to it. Moreover, somebody from another medical complex can't contribute to it. So it isn't really a personal health record. In fact, most of the systems out today are these so-called tethered personal health records. XYZ hospital, XYZ managed care system, XYZ insurance company says, here, we'll let you peek at what we've got for you. You just take a look at it. Now in the Netherlands, you know, it's a little tidier to deal with what's happening with personal health information. The Dutch law says, you know, personal health information cannot be peeked at by anybody without the patient's explicit consent. So, for instance, if Dr. A at Hospital Z wants to send information to Dr. B at Hospital X, the patient has to explicitly approve that sharing of information. It's not like in this country where, you know, well, it's under the rubric of care management, you know. I referred the patient, I shared this stuff. That right is just explicit all throughout the Netherlands. It's created some interesting challenges for them. The other thing, of course, that's very interesting is the patients have a right of access to their own records in a much more tightly governed way than we do in this country. I mean, you know, you go to the hospital, the doctor's office, say, I want to have a copy of my records, and they say, okay, this is how much it's going to cost us to Xerox, copy this stuff, and here's the bill for it, and you come back in X period of time, and maybe we'll have it, and maybe we won't. In the electronic world, it should be a lot easier, and yet people haven't come to grips with how it is that you export information out of these big systems for a copy for patients. I mean, seriously speaking, if I went to Kaiser and said, I need to get all my information out of Epic, it would be dog's work. Dog's work. So, disclosure of that personal health information in the Netherlands is against the law unless it's all done properly. Now, the Dutch electronic patient record system, by the way, this slide is already outdated because, as I understand it from my spies in the Netherlands, all these lovely people that help us out here, they just pulled the plug on this about 3 weeks ago. So this thing, which was, going great guns, may have collapsed. There are some reasons why I suggest that might have happened. Because clinical information is not stored in a central area at all because of what we've just gone through. So there's no such thing truly as a longitudinal record of your information across all venues of care. It's distributed. It's held by all these source systems. So if you want to try to pull that together, you have to go through a patient consent mediated query that then pulls that information from these various sources and assembles it in some form. And I'm a little worried about the form of that. And then maybe you can get to it. So it's like this. They have this thing called a national switching point. Now, those of you who've been around the block on the early adventures in the National Healthcare Information Network in the United States will recognize this as being a Markle model, a distributed model where, the last thing we want to do is put that information in a centralized place because we won't be able to control who's going to look at it and all this other kind of stuff, which made me crazy then, makes me crazy now. So we have information that's on these GBZs, that is to say these are these well-managed care systems in the doctor's offices that comply with some kind of standard for, assessing who's allowed to look at this stuff under what circumstances. And then we have doctors on the left-hand side who make requests through this switching point, and then the folks on the other side say, okay, we'll go. We will then recertify, resecure everything, and we'll start shipping it out in some way or another. Now, this absolutely flies in the face of reason, as I understand reason. And I rely on a technical paper done by ISO some years ago, which basically said, there are two models for this so-called shared longitudinal electronic health record. One of them's federated, I just described that, and the other one's consolidated, where, somehow or other, you do aggregate this information in a push fashion in a meaningful space. And if you read through that white paper, they conclude that that gives you simpler access control, better security, and is likely to have a better price-to-performance ratio. Well, that's all well and good, but that just completely blows a hole in the Dutch law. So, how do you get around it? Well, last year, this outfit, don't ask me, my Dutch is terrible, Stichting Regiment, approached us to establish a partnership for developing a system that would resolve the tension. And they had discovered us by just wandering around and looking at Googling open source and who was doing it and whatnot. And they stumbled on Tolven. They read our white papers. They downloaded our stuff and said, well, we think there's something here that we ought to work with. So they started making inquiries, both at SourceForge and info at Tolven, blah, blah, blah. And, we responded. And then after a while, we said, this is getting to be a time waster, or a time spender. Not a time waster. Never waste time spender. You need to develop a support contract with us. Well, now that's one of the interesting things about Tolven. When we founded Tolven, we founded it as two organizations, a .org, which owns and controls the code and has a separate board of governors, and a .com that provides support services. And the support services include informatics support services, custom coding, and basic, bug fix, backup, certification kind of stuff. This has turned out to be a really good deal for us in terms of moving both our business model forward. The .com generates revenue that supports the .org. By the way, the system that was being described as had to scale up to 3.5 million patients. Well, fortunately, we'd already done a benchmark with Sun systems that demonstrated that, we knew how to do this. We knew how to absorb millions of pieces of healthcare records on millions of citizens on not terribly expensive hardware. And our .org website has the pointer to where that is. Okay, so in the initial step of the implementation, clinical information is pushed from a hospital complex, imagine a major university medical center, and the agreement is that it's become CDA formatted documents, and it gets pushed to an aggregation area within the enterprise firewalls where Tolven starts to exercise its own particular approach to this, which is to say, give us the stuff, and we will use rules to process the information to not only So we not only preserve the fidelity of the CDA document, but we also begin to process the payloads inside the document. Now, the patient has to opt in to even have this initial step happen, because in this first set of stuff, no one can see this information, period. It's just there as a holding area. Okay. Then we develop in a separate, if you will, location, whether it's logical or physical, but it's outside the firewalls, a series of accounts in health record banks. And we're very particular about this notion. I'm using the term health record bank as opposed to health record safety deposit box, or a shorter term often is called vault, because a safety deposit box, you actually can get in exactly, or get out exactly what you put in. You put grandma's jewelry in there, you can go back a couple weeks later and get grandma's jewelry out. But if you put in dollars, you can't get out euros. It's not fungible. Whereas a bank provides the opportunity for having fungibility. So we think of that as being very important for throughput. We don't want to create a data cemetery. We want this to be a meaningful place to store and forward data when necessary. So the accounts are set up inside this health record bank, and the technology, that is to say the information model and the vocabulary, is synchronized with the aggregation area. In addition, we create accounts for clinicians. So the doctors on that left-hand side that want information now begin to have accounts within this health record bank environment. The boundaries between accounts are strictly enforced. Absolutely nothing can happen for exchange of information between those accounts without explicit permission of the account holder. And what happens is you don't peek into somebody else's account. Well, that's nice, because Pacific Gas and Electric can't peek into my bank account. You know, I basically copy out money to send to them, if you get the metaphor. So, in other words, we're in the mode of creating certified authenticated copies with audit trails that get shipped out of this stuff. Okay, so the patient can initiate a request to have copies of his or her medical information forwarded to his or her PHR account. And this request may be in the form of a subscription, so that the information will be automatically copied unless the patient cancels the subscription. But if that's what they want to have happen, there it comes. Now, what's interesting is when this information is leaving one area and going to another, it's encrypted. It's encrypted in transit. It's also encrypted at rest. So within the health record bank area, nobody can see that information except the account holder. Okay, so double encryption. Okay, then clinicians basically publish their availability to receive copies of this patient information. And patients can find clinicians in an online directory. They say, oh, well, there's good. There's Dr. DeSmet's. You know, I really want him to have all or some of my information. So they find the clinicians in the directory and then select what portions of their clinical information should be copied to the other record. Now, recall in this, it is only the patient who is likely to have the accumulation of all of the information about their health care, should they wish to. I mean, they don't have to accept it, but they're the ones that they're sitting in the catbird seat. And clinicians will be lucky enough to have all that information if the patient trusts them enough to give it to them. Okay, now, if the doctor wants to send information to another doctor, of course, they have to initiate a request that goes to the patient, and the patient says, okay, I'm going to send you, again, another encrypted copy of the stuff I've selected. So the health record itself, because we've processed it, we've used our rules to get payloads out of it. The payloads are stored in rows and tables, standard relational database stuff. The original document, of course, is kept for fidelity. But we have a thing called browse everything. So you can browse the entire record and pick out the stuff you want. It requires a little fancy, schmancy stuff on the GUI, and I'm not going to be able to show you all the GUI stuff that goes with this. So patients can send copies in a variety of electronic formats, including CCR, CCD, outside the boundaries of the health record bank. However, this kind of sharing and copying can no longer be governed by the rules of the HRB. So it's basically like, it's fine. You take your money out of the bank, and if you drop it on the sidewalk, we're out of luck. So it does involve a trusted set of relationships between two entities, and there's more and more of that going on at least in the United States, developing that trust that says, these are the rules inside my organization. Do you have the commensurate rules inside your organization so that the patient's consent is honored for that, or the patient's desires, not consent? Yeah, I was going to do a demonstration until, number one, we were running out of time. Number two, I was using the internet in the speaker's lounge yesterday, and for 5 hours, nobody could get anything. So I thought, well, that's not a good thing to think about. Let's pass that over. Now, but I'm more than happy to do this online for you at any time or show you anywhere else. What's interesting about all this is we've just completely blown open the notion of patient consent. There is no such thing. There is no such thing as patient consent because nobody's peeking into anybody else's stuff. Well, no surprise. I have a checking account at Wells Fargo. I never signed a consent form to have a checking account, for heaven's sakes. It's basically, you know, everything is done through the explicit action of the affected party, the patient. And personal health records can be held by a patient and their spouse and their significant other and their. You can be an agent for your infirm and disabled father or your kids. So concept of agency becomes part of personal health records. An account is simply a logical group of users from 1 to X. Okay. So unauthorized copying can, of course, still happen. And, you know, the only protection in that is the kind of thing we see on the bottom of emails that we say, ho, ho, ho. If you've even read the email that far before you forward it, you know, you forward the email and you say, oh, my God, here's that tail that's coming across it. I shouldn't have done it. Even inside the health record bank, and this is true of all systems, and why it is that we don't just say this right out loud, shout it out loud. You can take screenshots of anything. You can take digital pictures of anything. Or in the case of, you know, the place where I spent 26 years of my life, which was the University of Chicago Medical Center, after about a year and a half after I left, 4 nurses in the area that I supervised were summarily dismissed from their jobs. Why? They heard gossiping about a piece of healthcare information on a colleague. So, you know, we're never going to actually totally safeguard that, but unless we get over the magic that says we know how to safeguard everything, we're going to have to take account of all these things. So we've used nothing but open source components. All of our stuff is contributed to open source. We have a project on SourceForge. And we've used those components to create this environment for consumer-controlled sharing of health information. So ironically, it's always funny when people say, oh, open source, aren't you worried about security? Well, no, you folks know better than that. But a lot of people don't. They say, oh, that open source stuff, that means anybody can do anything. Well, it's just not true. And we incorporate standards for semantic interoperability so that the technology we use is not just applicable to this project in the Netherlands, but we support multiple physician offices in the Midwest. We support a clinical research exchange that runs across 18 academic medical centers in this country collaborating on breast cancer. We're the selected solution for the National Health Group for all the citizens of Singapore. It's interesting. It's just a code line that is very durable and has a lot of potential for creating these personalities, both in a crossway like a health information exchange and in deep domain applications like breast cancer documentation and clinical research. I have talked plenty long. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, please. And by the way, I'm amazed that people can see anything with this light going on, but that's just me. Yeah, so scream if I don't see your hand. Well, now, isn't that interesting? And you may imagine we actually thought about that. So we encourage people to set up yet another kind of account. An account that you say, okay, I really want my critical information stored in this account. These are the trusted people who manage that account. And if something like that happens, it's something everybody can know about by whatever, whether a tattoo or whatever else you have, a bracelet.
There's a master identity account, but you have sub-personalities.
Correct. And so then the people who are responsible for emergency access, what other people are pleased to call break the glass, we don't call it break the glass because they actually have authorized access to that account. Everything they do is audited, and you can put rules in there that says, oh, by the way, if this thing gets accessed, another body gets notified that this is happening, and so you build, in other words, you build nested rules. You all know that, but people outside are building very complex, monolithic things that just fall apart. You build nested rules to take care of that. Yeah, It's a good point. Thanks for asking. Gives me a chance to show off just a little bit. Thanks. Any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
So this approach to managing care seems like it needs to start in medical school. It needs to start with the physicians as well, at least in the States, definitely. Do you know that that's happening necessarily?
Well, in the electronic world, personal health records are still treated as toys. So I think that having a project like this moving forward could be very enlightening. I can only tell you that in my own practice, sharing of information was critical to the way I did it, and it was critical to the way I taught. And so all of my students and house staff, in the old days when we used to do dictation, I'd say, dictate the note when the patient's still in the room. At least then you're sharing information. We didn't have the possibility of anything as clever as this to actually share stuff, copies of stuff, but that's my idea. So yes, you have to, early on in medical it starts out with saying, there are all sorts of people who care for an individual. And some of those people include the individual, him or herself. So you have to get over the notion that only doctors can do this. So you have to broaden the whole care team, all the way through patients, their families, and school teachers, and everybody else, can be part of a care team. That's where I think it starts. Then the electronic manifestation of that becomes simply an illustration of the logic that you started to teach already, which is what I think good software design is all about. Yes and no. I encourage people to never think about that, because you must think about a medical record as a subpoenable document. So you should never put in the medical record something you don't want the patient to see, because you're just hosed. So don't do it. Don't do it.
Well, I mean,
like what?
Maybe they're not an MD, maybe they're a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and I don't know if that falls within the realm.
Sure it does. Yeah. And what is it?
I mean, that's a common practice as far as I know in that.
Well, yeah, but and I always sit down and I say, okay, give me the example that you're going to go through, doctor, psychologist, psychiatrist. What is it that you don't want the patient to see? I just need to understand it. Once I understand it, we can figure out a way to do it. Because, yeah, this is open source software. You can configure yourself into a hole. What I want to make sure of is you don't configure yourself into a hole where you're going to get your pantsuit off.
Well, and that's what I guess I mean. Is there a provision for keeping just parts of their record germane to healthcare providers? You know what I mean? So that you're opening as much up to the patient as possible, but is it necessary even to have a stub of their patient record that's only visible to healthcare providers?
And to the court.
Or certain kinds of
and to the court.
Right.
No. Well, I mean, think about it. What I just said was and to the court. So, yeah, you, the patient, can't see it. But, by the way, if anything comes to trial, the world will see it.
Is that specific to Dutch law? Or is that
No, that's the U.S. I mean, this is the crazy stuff. I mean, I did a lot of malpractice advising. And so doctors would say, I'll put this sticky note in the chart. And then I'll take it out. And unbeknownst to them, somebody had Xerox both times. And, you just get into big, big trouble. It isn't worth it. It isn't worth it. Share the information. If you want to do something else, keep it on paper notes, but don't put it in anything that resembles an official electronic. And by the way, even if it's in paper notes, you better be damn sure nobody knows you've got it, because they'll subpoena it. They'll subpoena every single paper clip in your office.
On that encryption note.
Oh, I agree. The only thing you could have said better is drinks are served. Thanks.